Wherever you are right now, maybe you are lying in bed with one arm tucked under your pillow. Maybe the ceiling above you is familiar. Maybe the sounds outside your window are the same sounds they always are at this hour. I want you to just settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw go soft. Because tonight we are going somewhere. And the place we are going is one of the most famous cities on the face of this earth. You already think you know it. That is exactly why this is going to be interesting. Now, before we begin, I want to ask you something genuinely important. Where are you listening from tonight? Not the city, not the country, necessarily. I mean, where are you right now in this moment? Are you in a small town somewhere? In a house that has been quiet for hours? Are you in an apartment with the low hum of traffic somewhere 2 floors below? Are you in New York itself? Which would make this whole thing wonderfully strange. Lying in the city we are about to pull apart like an old letter. Somebody folded wrong and put back in the wrong envelope? Type it in the comments if you feel like it. And while you are down there, type any topic you would like me to cover next. Any topic at all. History, food, a civilization, a strange old tradition, a thing you have always wondered about at 11 o'clock at night. I will see every single one of them. I read comments the way certain people read horoscopes, with great enthusiasm and absolutely no guarantees. But now, New York City. Let me collapse something for you immediately, because there is a version of this city that lives in almost every human mind on the planet, and it was built mostly by movies, tourism posters, and a surprisingly small number of very loud people who convinced the rest of us that they were the only ones who really understood New York. Here is what most people believe, summarized in about 4 sentences. New York was a quiet little Dutch trading post. Then the British came and renamed it. Then it grew. Then the Statue of Liberty arrived. Immigrants poured in, skyscrapers went up, and the rest is jazz and pizza and yellow taxis and the Yankees winning games they probably should not have won. That is the version. That is the postcard. And almost every piece of it is either wrong, incomplete, reversed in its logic, or missing the most interesting part entirely. Let us begin with the one that gets me every single time. Most people, when they think about who discovered New York, and I am using that word very loosely and with one eyebrow raised, most people think of Henry Hudson, the half-moon sailing through the harbor. Europeans arriving in a new place, the beginning. Except here is the thing that tends to make people go very quiet when they hear it. When Henry Hudson arrived in 1609, there were already somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 people living in what we now call the New York region. Not passing through, not camping. Living, with villages and trading networks and political structures and agricultural knowledge, and a relationship with that land that had been developing carefully, intelligently, continuously, for somewhere between 10,000 and 14,000 years. 10,000 years. Let that number sit with you for a moment. While Europe was still figuring out what to do with iron, while Rome was barely a rumor, while the first pyramids were only just being dreamed up in Egypt, people were already living in the place we now call New York. They had names for every hill, every river bend, every inlet. They knew which fish ran in which season. They knew the land's moods the way you know the moods of someone you have lived beside your whole life. And then a wooden ship appeared in their harbor, and we, somehow, across centuries of telling and retelling, turned that moment into a beginning, when it was, if anything, an interruption. Now here is the second collapse, and this one is slightly more absurd in the most wonderful way. You have probably heard the story of Manhattan being purchased for $24 worth of trinkets. It is one of those facts that everybody knows, the kind that gets repeated at dinner tables and in school hallways. $24. Glass beads. The greatest real estate deal in human history. Here is what actually happened, or more precisely, here is how magnificently more complicated it actually was. In 1626, a Dutch colonial administrator named Peter Minuit did conduct some kind of transaction with a group of Lenape people, but the Lenape who participated in that exchange were from a group that, and here is where it gets quietly extraordinary, may not have even been the primary people associated with the southern tip of Manhattan at that time. In Lenape tradition and in many indigenous frameworks of the period, land was not something you owned the way Europeans meant ownership. It was something you used. something you had relationship with. So the two parties in that 1626 transaction were almost certainly not agreeing on the same thing. The Dutch believed they were buying permanent, exclusive possession of an island. The Lenape may have understood it as something closer to a seasonal use agreement, a sharing of access, a relationship, not a receipt, and the 60 guilders, which somebody later calculated as approximately $24 in 19th century money, a calculation that then got frozen in time and repeated forever. Those 60 guilders were actually paid not in glass beads, as the legend insists, but likely in tools, cloth, and trade goods that were genuinely useful and valued. Not trinkets, not a swindle, at least not in the simple cartoonish way the story gets told. Something far messier and far more human and far more sad than a simple trick. Two completely different understandings of what a transaction even means, meeting in a harbor, and neither one fully able to translate itself to the other, that is, the actual beginning of New York's real estate market, by the way. Miscommunication and competing definitions of ownership. Some things, it turns out, were established very early. Now, before we go any further into the Dutch period, into the British period, into the revolutionary chaos and the immigrant tides and the skyscrapers and the subway and all of it, I want to make you a quiet promise about tonight. This is not a textbook reading. This is not a highlights reel of famous events stitched together with dramatic music you have to imagine. What we are going to do tonight is walk through New York. Not the New York of postcards. The New York of mud and fish smell and political argument. The New York of people who were cold in winter and worried about their children and trying to figure out how to get along with their neighbors and mostly failing in interesting ways. The New York that existed before anyone called it New York. The New York that several different empires tried to own and several different populations of people tried to survive. The New York that built itself into the sky not because it was inevitable, but because of a specific set of accidents and decisions and geological quirks and human stubbornness that we are going to trace tonight from the very beginning. One more thing before we settle into the deeper water of this history. There is a question I want to leave open right here at the start, like a window left ajar. When we say New York City, what do we actually mean? We mean 5 boroughs today: Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, Staten Island. But for most of its history, those were separate places with separate identities and sometimes genuinely hostile feelings about each other. They only became one city, officially, legally, the city of 5 boroughs in 1898, which means that the thing we call New York City, the unified thing, the thing you picture when you say the words, it is younger than you might expect. Younger, perhaps, than the grandfather of someone you know, and yet the place, the land, the water, the harbor, the bedrock under the skyscrapers, that is ancient in ways that should make us all slightly more humble every time we say the words New York like we invented it. So, wherever you are tonight, however comfortable your bed is or isn't, whatever sounds are outside your window, we are going back, all the way back, past the taxis and the steam rising from the grates in the street, past the immigrants and the skyscrapers and the jazz clubs, past the British flag and the Dutch trading posts, past the first European ship in the harbor, all the way back to a place that was green and cold, and full of people who had names for every hill, and who never imagined, not even in their strangest dreams, what was coming. That is where we start. Let us talk about the version of New York City that most of us inherited. Not the one from books you chose yourself. Not the one from serious documentaries you watched on purpose at a reasonable hour of the day. The one that just arrived. The one that seeped in through movies and school hallways and tourism commercials. And that one teacher who clearly loved New York a little too, personally, and made it everyone else's problem. That version goes something like this. New York is the greatest city in the world. It always has been. It was basically born great. The Dutch showed up, did some mild trading, the British took over, some revolutionary stuff happened, Ellis Island opened, the tired and the poor arrived by the millions, the Statue of Liberty pointed the way, jazz was invented in some smoky room, skyscrapers went up, Wall Street got complicated, and now it is the city that never sleeps, full of people who walk very fast and eat very good pizza, and have extremely strong opinions about which borough is best. That is the inherited version. And every single layer of it has something hidden underneath it. Something older, stranger, and considerably more interesting than the postcard allows. Let us start with the Dutch, because the Dutch are always a good place to start when you want to complicate a simple story. The popular version of New Amsterdam, which is what the Dutch called their little settlement on the southern tip of Manhattan, is that it was a quaint, modest trading post, a small European village planted in a new world. Wooden houses, windmills if you are feeling romantic about it, and a very large wall that eventually became Wall Street. That part about the wall is actually true, which is one of the great small pleasures of this history. Wall Street is called Wall Street because there was genuinely a wall there, built by the Dutch in the 1650s as a defensive barrier against potential English incursions from the north. The English incursion came from the sea instead, which is exactly the kind of thing that happens when you build a wall facing the wrong direction. But here is what the popular version almost always leaves out about New Amsterdam. It was, from its very earliest days, one of the most diverse places in the European colonial world. Not because the Dutch were unusually enlightened. Let us not romanticize them. They ran a brutal slave trade and treated indigenous peoples with a casual violence that is deeply uncomfortable to read about in primary sources. But the Dutch West India Company, which administered the colony, needed people, workers, traders, anyone willing to come and make the enterprise profitable. And so they got everyone. By some estimates, as early as the 1640s, people in New Amsterdam were speaking somewhere between 15 and 18 different languages. 15 to 18 languages, in a settlement of perhaps a few hundred people. You had Dutch merchants and Walloon farmers and German craftsmen and Portuguese Jewish merchants, the Sephardic Jewish community of New Amsterdam being one of the oldest and most fascinating threads in this entire history, and enslaved Africans, who in some cases were given a peculiar half-freedom that the Dutch called half-freedom, which was exactly as complicated and cruel as it sounds, and Lenape people trading furs and navigating a world that was changing under their feet faster than any generation before them had ever experienced. New Amsterdam was not a quaint Dutch village. It was, almost from the beginning, a loud, argumentative, multilingual, financially motivated mess of a place. Which is to say, it was already, in spirit, recognizably New York. Now let us talk about the British takeover, because the popular version of this event is almost comedically simplified. In 1664, a fleet of English warships sailed into New York Harbor and essentially said, "Hello, this is ours now," and the Dutch governor, a man named Peter Stuyvesant, who had a wooden leg and a famously terrible temper, and who had been making enemies in the colony for years by being spectacularly difficult to work with. Peter Stuyvesant wanted to fight. He really did. He was ready to defend the settlement. But the colonists, who had been living under Stuyvesant's governance and had fairly specific feelings about it, essentially said, "We are not doing that." They signed a petition. They refused to fight. They negotiated a surrender, and New Amsterdam became New York, named after the Duke of York, who would later become King James II of England, without a single shot being fired. The popular version treats this as a simple British victory, but what it actually was, if you read the primary sources carefully, was something more interesting. The colonists of New Amsterdam were not particularly attached to being Dutch subjects. They were attached to their property, their trade routes, their religious freedoms, their peculiar multilingual chaotic community. And the English, to their credit in this specific moment, offered to protect all of that. The terms of surrender that the Dutch negotiated were remarkably generous. People could keep their property. They could keep their customs. They could keep their language if they wanted to. They could keep their religion. New York was British in name and in governance. But underneath that, it remained something much harder to categorize, which is, again, one of those things that turns out to have been permanently true about this city. It absorbs its rulers. It outlasts its flags. And then there is Ellis Island. Oh, Ellis Island. This is one of the most emotionally loaded pieces of American mythology, and it deserves to be treated with both respect and a certain gentle honesty. The popular version is beautiful and not entirely wrong. Millions of people arrived. They came with almost nothing. They stood in long lines. An official sometimes changed their name, though this part is actually more complicated than the legend insists, and we will return to it later in the night. They passed through that enormous hall. They came out the other side as Americans. They built the city. Their grandchildren became presidents and musicians and builders and teachers. And the whole thing was a kind of miracle of human reinvention, and there is genuine truth in all of that. But here is what the Ellis Island story tends to quietly omit. Ellis Island processed immigrants from roughly 1892 to 1954. Before Ellis Island, there was Castle Garden, at the southern tip of Manhattan, which processed millions of immigrants from 1855 onward. And before Castle Garden, ships simply arrived and people got off. The Irish who fled the famine in the 1840s did not pass through Ellis Island. They came earlier through earlier systems, into a city that was not always welcoming, that had neighborhoods where signs in windows said things that are not comfortable to repeat, that had draft riots in 1863, in which the tensions between newly arrived Irish immigrants and the city's black population exploded into some of the most brutal urban violence in American history. 5 days of riots, more than 100 people dead, possibly many more. The Colored Orphan Asylum on Fifth Avenue burned to the ground. That is also New York. That is also the immigrant story. Not just the beautiful arrival through the golden door, but the brutal competition for the bottom rung of a very tall and very crowded ladder. The popular version of Ellis Island tends to skip directly from arrival to success, with a kind of warm montage energy that flattens the years of poverty and discrimination and survival that came between the two. The real version has more weather in it, more winter, more people sleeping 6 to a room in a building that a landlord had subdivided into a configuration that no building was ever designed to hold. More children working in factories at edges that should make us set down whatever we are, holding, and just sit quietly for a moment. That is also New York, and somehow, astonishingly, it is also still the place those families built. One more piece of the popular version that deserves a gentle correction before we move on. The Statue of Liberty. Most people think of the Statue of Liberty as a symbol of welcome, of immigration, of the open door. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. Emma Lazarus wrote those words in 1883 for a fundraising auction to help build the statue's pedestal, and they are genuinely beautiful words. But the statue itself was not originally conceived as a symbol of immigration at all. It was designed by a French sculptor named Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, and it was a gift from France to the United States conceived primarily as a symbol of the shared republican ideals of the two nations, of democracy, of the end of slavery after the Civil War, of the friendship between France and America. The immigration symbolism came later. It accumulated like most symbolism does, because the statue was standing in the right place, at the right time, and people needed something to look at when their ships came into the harbor. Emma Lazarus's poem was not even installed at the base of the statue until 1903, 17 years after the statue was dedicated. So the symbol of welcome was retrofitted, which is not to diminish it. Symbols that accumulate meaning organically are sometimes more powerful than symbols that are designed from the start. But it is worth knowing that the most famous symbol of New York's open arms was not originally about open arms at all. It was about politics and friendship, and the complicated transatlantic relationship between two nations who admired each other's revolutions. The arms opened later, because the city needed them to. Now we go back, all the way back, past every European ship, past every flag, past every name that was given and taken and changed again, back to the land itself, because the land has a story that has nothing to do with any of the names we gave it. And it is a story that is, in some ways, the most extraordinary chapter in this entire history. Approximately 20,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years in either direction. And when we are talking about geological time, a few thousand years is basically rounding to the nearest whole number. The place we now call New York was covered in ice. Not a little ice. Not a hard winter. A glacial sheet, the Laurentide ice sheet that was in places over a mile thick. 1 mile of ice sitting on top of what is now Central Park and Fifth Avenue and the Brooklyn Bridge and every bodega that has ever sold you a bacon, egg, and cheese at 7 in the morning, 1 mile of ice. And that ice was doing something important. As it moved slowly, with the kind of patience that only geological processes have, it was carving the land, scraping it, depositing material in some places and removing it from others. The harbor that would eventually make New York one of the greatest ports in the world, that harbor was shaped by glaciers. The bedrock that would eventually allow New York to build skyscrapers taller than any city on Earth had built. Before, that bedrock was a product of ancient geological forces that predate not just human history, but most of what we would recognize as modern life on this planet. When the ice retreated, somewhere around 15,000 years ago, it left behind a landscape of rivers and forests and wetlands, and a harbor so naturally sheltered and so perfectly positioned that it was almost as if something had designed it for the specific purpose of becoming the busiest port in the Western Hemisphere. Which, of course, nothing had. It was just ice and time and the absolute indifference of geology. But the results were spectacular. The first humans in the New York region arrived sometime after the glaciers retreated. Archaeologists and anthropologists have various estimates for exactly when, and the honest answer is that the evidence is still being debated and refined. But the broad consensus suggests human presence in the region going back at least 12,000 years. And possibly considerably longer. These earliest people were Paleo-Indians, a term archaeologists use, not a term any of these people would have used for themselves, who followed large game animals through a landscape that looked very different from what we would recognize today. The coastline was different. Sea levels were lower because so much water was still locked in glacial ice elsewhere in the world. The climate was colder. The forests were different. These were people living in a world that was still settling itself after the Ice Age, still figuring out what it was going to be. And they were walking through it, hunting through it, camping through it, learning it. The oldest confirmed archaeological evidence of human presence in the greater New York area comes from various sites around the region, including some on Long Island and in the Hudson Valley. Most of the evidence from Manhattan itself is difficult to access because, as you might imagine, building several centuries of very heavy infrastructure on top of a landscape tends to complicate archaeological excavation. But what we know from the regional evidence and from oral histories passed down through indigenous nations is that people were here continuously for an enormously long time. By the time of European contact in the 16th and early 17th centuries, the people living in what is now the New York metropolitan area belonged primarily to two broad cultural and linguistic groupings. The Lenape, sometimes called the Delaware by European colonists, a name they gave them based on the river that the colonists had named after a colonial governor, occupied the western part of the region, including Manhattan itself, parts of what is now New Jersey, and territories stretching into Pennsylvania and Delaware. The Munsee, who are closely related to the Lenape and share linguistic and cultural connections, occupied much of what is now the lower Hudson Valley and surrounding areas. The relationship between Lenape and Munsee identity is itself complex and deserves more than a quick summary. But for our purposes tonight, what matters is understanding that both groups had rich, sophisticated, deeply rooted ways of life in this specific landscape. And then there were the Canarsie, who occupied much of what is now Brooklyn, and the Rockaway, associated with the Rockaway Peninsula in Queens, and the Mattinacock on Long Island, and other groups across the broader region, each with their own relationships to specific territories, their own political structures, their own seasonal patterns of life. This was not empty land. This was not wilderness in the sense that European colonists often meant the word, a blank space waiting to be filled with meaning. It was full of people who had been negotiating their relationships with each other, with the land, with the seasons, with the spirit world as they understood it, for thousands of years. The word Manhattan itself is one of the more debated etymological puzzles in American place name history. And etymological puzzles are exactly the kind of thing worth discussing at this hour of night, because they are interesting enough to keep your mind gently engaged but not so dramatic. that they will keep you awake. The name Manhattan almost certainly derives from a Lenape word. But linguists and historians have proposed several different interpretations of what that word originally meant. One common interpretation is Mannahatta, meaning something close to island of many hills. Henry Hudson's first mate, Robert Youet, who kept a journal of the 1609 voyage, recorded a version of the name that various scholars have interpreted in this way. Other interpretations suggest meanings related to the place where we get bows, referring to the type of wood found there, or references to a whirlpool or to the general character of the land. The most recent and most careful linguistic scholarship, particularly work drawing on deep knowledge of the Lenape language, leans toward interpretations connected to the landscape, the hills, the waterways, the specific physical character of the island. What all of these interpretations share is that the name Manhattan is a description. It is a name that someone who knew the place gave to it based on what the place actually was. An island of hills, or an island of certain trees, or an island with a particular water feature that mattered to the people who lived along its shores. Not a name chosen from a list, not a name honoring a distant monarch, a name that came from looking at the actual land and saying, yes, that is what this is. That is actually a beautiful way to name a place. We do not do it much anymore. The Lenape relationship with Manhattan was not a simple settlement pattern. They did not live on Manhattan year-round in a fixed village the way European colonists would later organize themselves. They moved, not aimlessly, not randomly. They moved according to a sophisticated seasonal calendar that made the best possible use of the resources available in different parts of their territory at different times of year. In spring and summer, they would move toward the coast and the rivers, fishing, harvesting shellfish. The oyster beds in what is now New York Harbor were, by all historical accounts, extraordinary. Some oyster shells found in the region were as large as dinner plates. The harbor was rich in a way that is almost impossible to imagine now. In fall, they would harvest the wild crops. The three sisters of corn, beans, and squash were cultivated in some areas and gather nuts and berries in the forests. In winter, they would move to more sheltered inland locations, hunting deer and other animals, living in smaller groups in the protection of the forest. Manhattan in this system was not a permanent home for any single large community. It was part of a larger seasonal landscape. A place you came to at certain times of year for certain purposes. A place with specific meaning within a much larger geography of meaning. The idea of owning Manhattan, of drawing a line around it, and saying this specific island is permanently and exclusively mine, would have been, in the Lenape worldview, a strange kind of category error. Like trying to own a season, like trying to own the moment when the fish start running. The first confirmed European to sail into New York Harbor was almost certainly not Henry Hudson. This is one of those facts that tends to produce a quiet, satisfying kind of surprise. In 1524, a Florentine explorer named Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailing under the French flag, entered New York Harbor. He anchored briefly. He wrote a description of the land and the people he encountered. He described a beautiful bay, well protected, with green hills and friendly inhabitants who came out to meet his ship in canoes, and then he left. He did not stay. He did not establish a settlement. He was mapping the coastline for the French crown, and he moved on. The Verrazzano Narrows, the stretch of water between Brooklyn and Staten Island, which is now spanned by the bridge that carries his name, is named for him. He saw it. He floated through it. He wrote it down. And then he disappeared back into history, mostly uncredited for the discovery that he technically made 85 years before Henry Hudson arrived. After Verrazzano, other European explorers passed through or near the region. There is evidence of Portuguese exploration in the area in the 1520s and 1530s. Basque fishermen may have known these waters before any official explorer recorded them. The sea was not empty before Hudson. The land was not empty before the Dutch. The whole concept of discovery, once you start pulling at its edges, tends to unravel in the most instructive possible way. There is one object that I want to introduce here as a kind of quiet touchstone for this chapter, an oyster shell, not a metaphor, an actual oyster shell. Archaeologists excavating sites around the New York region, along the shores of Manhattan on Staten Island, in parts of Brooklyn and the Bronx, have found what are called shell middens. Middens are, essentially, ancient garbage heaps, places where people deposited the remains of their meals over long periods of time. And in and around New York, some of these middens contain oyster shells accumulated over hundreds of years of seasonal habitation. When you hold an oyster shell from one of these sites, and some of them date back thousands of years, you are holding something that a person picked up, opened, ate from, and set down in essentially the same location where it was eventually found by a modern archaeologist. The distance between that person and a city of 8 million people is enormous. The distance between that person's hunger and your hunger is essentially nothing. They were eating. They were feeding their children. They were sitting near the water on a summer afternoon, probably because it is nicer near the water in summer, and that has always been true and will always be true, regardless of what century it is. The oyster shell survives. The city was built over the midden, and underneath the skyscrapers, if you go far enough down, there is still that ancient shoreline. Still those shells, still evidence of dinner. Every city gets reshaped by power. That is not a cynical observation. It is simply a fact about how cities work, and New York is perhaps the single most instructive example in the Western world of what happens when power after power after power decides that a particular piece of land is worth having. Because from the moment European ships began taking the harbor seriously in the early 17th century, New York has been, in various ways, and under various flags and through various economic systems, a prize. Something to be owned, something to be controlled, something to be taxed, exploited, organized, reorganized, torn down, built up, and argued about in rooms where the people who actually live there are not present. And each time a new power put its hands on the city changed. And each time the city changed, something was lost, and something was also sometimes unexpectedly gained. That is the history of power and New York in one sentence. Let us go through it slowly. The Dutch West India Company was the first major institutional power to reshape what would become New York. And the Dutch West India Company was not, it is worth saying clearly, a government in any sense that we would recognize today. It was a corporation, a joint stock company chartered by the Dutch government and given enormous authority over trade, settlement, and military action in a huge swath of the world, including the Atlantic coast of North America. The primary interest of the Dutch West India Company in the New York region was fur, specifically beaver fur. This sounds almost comically modest compared to what the region would eventually become. But in the early 17th century, beaver fur was one of the most valuable commodities in the European market. It was used to make felt hats, which were enormously fashionable among the European upper classes, and the beaver population in Europe had been severely depleted by centuries of trapping. North America had beavers in essentially unlimited quantities. The Hudson River Valley, above Manhattan, was perfect beaver country, so the Dutch West India Company set up a trading post. First on the southern tip of Manhattan, then also upriver at what is now Albany, for the primary purpose of getting beaver furs from indigenous trappers and shipping them back to Europe. Everything else about New Amsterdam, the settlers, the buildings, the governance, the community, was secondary to the fur trade. This is important to understand because it shapes everything about how the colony was administered. The Dutch West India Company did not particularly care about building a prosperous community. They cared about profit margins, and when the interests of the settlers conflicted with the interests of the company, which happened regularly because the settlers wanted things like fair land rights and local governance and basic security, and the company wanted things like cheaper labor and higher returns. The company generally won, until it started losing. The governance of New Amsterdam went through several directors, and most of them range from mediocre to actively counterproductive in terms of their relationships with both the colonists and the indigenous peoples of the region. But the one who looms largest, partly because he is the most vivid character, and partly because his failures were the most spectacular, is Peter Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant arrived as Director General in 1647, and immediately set about making himself unpopular with almost everyone. He was a Calvinist of the most rigid variety, which meant he had strong opinions about how other people should live, and was not shy about expressing those opinions in the form of laws. He tried to restrict the sale of alcohol. The colonists ignored this with impressive consistency. He tried to expel the Quakers who arrived in the colony seeking religious tolerance. A group of colonists in Flushing, in what is now Queens, wrote a remarkable document in 1657 called the Flushing Remonstrance, in which they essentially told Stuyvesant that religious tolerance was a principle worth defending, even for people whose beliefs they did not share. This document is sometimes called the first legal protest for religious freedom in American history. Stuyvesant ignored it. He arrested the people who signed it. He also tried to prevent the small Jewish community, mostly Sephardic refugees who had fled Brazil when the Portuguese retook it from the Dutch, from settling permanently, from trading freely, from building a synagogue. The Jewish community appealed directly to the Dutch West India Company in Amsterdam. Several of the company's shareholders were Jewish. The company overruled Stuyvesant. The Jewish community stayed. Congregation Shearith Israel, which traces its origins to that 1654 community of Sephardic Jews in New Amsterdam, is still an active congregation in New York City today. It is the oldest Jewish congregation in North America. 370 years of continuous presence. Peter Stuyvesant tried to send them away. They outlasted him. They outlasted the Dutch. They outlasted several versions of the city itself. Then came the British in 1664, and with them came a different kind of power. The British colonial administration had a different relationship to governance than the Dutch West India Company. Where the Dutch company was primarily interested in extracting commercial value, the British were interested in something more ambitious and more complicated, building an empire. Empire means not just profit but permanence, not just extraction but transformation. Under British rule, New York began to develop the institutional structures that would shape it for the next century. A city charter was granted in 1665. Courts were established. Property law was formalized. The political structure of local governance began to take shape. And along with all of this came something that the British were very good at, and which had enormous consequences for the people who had the least power in the colony: the expansion and formalization of slavery. Enslaved Africans had been present in New Amsterdam from the earliest years of the Dutch period. The Dutch West India Company was deeply involved in the Atlantic slave trade, and it brought enslaved people to New Amsterdam as a labor force from the 1620s onward. But under British rule, slavery was codified, expanded, and made more brutal in its legal structure. By the early 18th century, New York City had one of the largest enslaved populations of any city in the British North American colonies north of the Chesapeake. This is something that often surprises people because slavery is more commonly associated in the popular imagination with the American South. But New York's economy in the colonial period was deeply entangled with slavery, not just through the enslaved people who lived and worked in the city itself, but through the trade networks that connected New York merchants to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean and the tobacco plantations of the South. New York merchants financed the slave trade. New York shipbuilders built slave ships. New York insurers insured the human cargo. The wealth that built colonial New York was not separate from slavery. It was built on it, around it, through it. This is not a comfortable thing to say about a city that would later present itself as a symbol of freedom and welcome, but it is historically accurate. And the people who built New York with their labor, the people who cleared the land, constructed the buildings, unloaded the ships, cooked the food, raised the children of the wealthy, those people deserve to be in this story. They are in this story. The American Revolution reshaped New York in a way that tends to get simplified into patriotic clarity that the actual experience did not have. Here is the complicated truth. New York City was one of the most loyalist cities in the 13 colonies. A very large portion of New York's population, merchants, landowners, professionals, people with economic ties to Britain, did not particularly want independence. When the British Army took New York in August and September of 1776, in a series of battles in which George Washington's forces were badly outmaneuvered and barely escaped complete destruction, A significant portion of the city's civilian population was quietly, and sometimes openly, relieved. The British occupied New York from September 1776 until November 1783. 7 years. For 7 years, New York City was the headquarters of British military operations in North America. It was the most important British-held city on the continent, and during those 7 years, tens of thousands of American prisoners of war were held on prison ships anchored in Wallabout Bay in what is now the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Those prison ships are one of the darkest and least discussed chapters in American Revolutionary history. Estimates suggest that more Americans died on those prison ships, from disease, starvation, and neglect, than died in all the battlefield combat of the entire Revolutionary War. More Americans died in New York Harbor, in those rotting hulks, than at Valley Forge and Bunker Hill and Yorktown combined. Their remains were eventually buried, inadequately, along the Brooklyn shoreline. Bones kept washing up on the beach for decades afterward. A monument was eventually built, but the prison ships are not in the movie version of the Revolution. They are in the actual one. After the Revolution, New York's moment of institutional transformation came faster than almost anyone could have predicted. In 1785, New York City became, briefly, the capital of the new United States. George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States on April 30, 1789, on the balcony of Federal Hall in Lower Manhattan. The first Congress met in New York. The first Supreme Court held its first session in New York. For a brief, extraordinary moment, the muddy, multilingual, commercially chaotic city on the island of many hills was the center of a new nation, trying to figure out what it was. And then the capital moved. First to Philadelphia as part of a political compromise, then to Washington, permanently in 1800. New York lost the title of national capital after just a few years, and responded, characteristically, by becoming more powerful anyway. Because the thing about New York is that it never needed to be the political capital to be the actual capital. The harbor made it the commercial center. The Hudson River made it the gateway to the interior. The sheer density of ambition and need and human variety that had always characterized the place made it magnetic in ways that no act of Congress could legislate into existence elsewhere. The power moved to Washington. The money stayed in New York. And money, as New York has been demonstrating since the days of the beaver fur trade, tends to be the more durable form of power in the long run. One final piece of this chapter deserves a moment of quiet attention. The Erie Canal. Built between 1817 and 1825, the Erie Canal connected the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, which connected New York City to the entire interior of the North American continent. Before the Erie Canal, getting goods from the interior of the country to the coast was slow, expensive, and often not worth it. After the Erie Canal, New York became the commercial gateway through which the produce of half a continent flowed to the rest of the world. The canal did not just change New York's economy. It essentially guaranteed that New York would be the dominant American city for the next century. Other cities, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, were competing seriously for commercial supremacy at the time. The Erie Canal ended that competition. It was an act of engineering, yes, but it was also an act of power. It was New York State deciding that it would reshape the geography of trade in its own favor, and it worked. Spectacularly, completely. The power of geography, unlocked by human engineering, applied by institutional ambition. That is New York. That has always been New York. Let us slow down now. Let us stop looking at maps and flags and corporate charters for a moment. Let us instead walk into the city, not the city of monuments and declarations and famous decisions made in famous rooms. The other city, the one that existed between the monuments. The one where people woke up in the morning with bad breath and cold feet and worried about whether they had enough money to eat that week, and whether the baby's cough was getting worse or better, and whether the landlord was going to come by today or tomorrow. That city, because that is the city where the actual history happened. Not in the governor's mansion, in the kitchen, in the alley, in the shared outdoor privy that 6 families used and nobody was happy about. Let us begin in the Dutch period, because it is the earliest layer we can examine with reasonable detail, and because daily life in New Amsterdam was strange and hard and occasionally very funny in ways that the history books rarely acknowledge. The Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam were not, by and large, the prosperous merchant class of Amsterdam who had the comfortable houses along the canals. They were, more typically, people who had been recruited, sometimes quite aggressively, by the Dutch West India Company because the company needed bodies in the colony and was having difficulty convincing respectable people to go. The conditions in New Amsterdam in the early years were genuinely rough. The housing was poor. Many of the first settlers lived in structures dug into the hillside, essentially pits covered with wooden planks and bark, not quaint Dutch cottages, holes in the ground with roofs. The winters were colder than most of the settlers had expected. The Hudson River freezes. The harbor sometimes froze. The wind coming off the water has a particular personality that residents of New York still recognize today, a sharp, opinionated wind that arrives in January and makes its views known immediately. Food in the early period was a combination of what could be grown locally, what could be traded with the Lenape, and what could be imported at great expense and considerable delay from the Netherlands. The Lenape trade was, frankly, what kept the colony alive in its early years. Corn, beans, squash, dried fish, foods that the Lenape had been cultivating and preserving in this specific climate for generations. These were the foods that got Dutch colonists through their first winters, which is one of those historical ironies that sits quietly in the record, rarely emphasized. The people whom the colonists would eventually dispossess were, in the early years of the colony, the people who were keeping the colonists fed. The smells of New Amsterdam and early New York are worth a moment of attention, not because they were pleasant, they were not, but because they tell us something real about what it meant to be alive in a city in those centuries. There were pigs everywhere. New Amsterdam's pigs were a genuine civic problem. They roamed the streets freely, eating garbage, which was technically useful, but also rooting up gardens, frightening horses, and occasionally biting people, which was less useful. There were multiple attempts by the colonial government to regulate the pigs. The pigs were not regulated. They continued roaming. There was also the matter of waste disposal, which in a city without plumbing meant that chamber pots were emptied out of windows. There was a customary shout of warning that was supposed to precede this action, though the historical record suggests the warning was not always given, and that the streets accumulated a particular quality of mud that was not entirely mud. The water situation was complicated. Fresh water had to be fetched from wells or collected from rain. The Hudson River water near the settlement was increasingly brackish and not safe for drinking as the settlement grew, and yet people managed. They cooked on open hearths. They kept small gardens. They traded with neighbors. They brewed beer, because beer was considered safer to drink than the water, which tells you something important about both the beer and the water. The taverns of New Amsterdam and early New York were among the most important social institutions in the city. Not just for drinking, though the drinking was considerable. The tavern was where you got news, where you heard about ships arriving in the harbor and what they carried, where you learned about political developments in the colony and in Europe, where disputes were settled, sometimes legally, and sometimes with the kind of physical argument that required the attention of the constable. Peter Stuyvesant, who had opinions about everything, had opinions about taverns specifically. He thought there were too many of them, and that they operated on too many days of the week. He was not wrong about the quantity. By some estimates, by the 1650s, nearly 1 in 4 buildings in New Amsterdam was either a tavern or a brewery, 1 in 4, which tells you something about what the colonists felt they needed to get through the day. Now let us move forward in time to the 18th century, because daily life in colonial New York in the 1700s has a texture that is both more recognizable and more foreign than the Dutch period. More recognizable because the city is larger now. There are real streets with names. There are churches and schools and markets. There is a social structure complex enough to generate gossip, which is always a sign that a community has achieved a certain level of organization. More foreign because the inequalities of that world were extreme in ways that daily life made impossible to ignore. A merchant's wife in the 1740s might wake in a house on Pearl Street that had 4 or 5 rooms, a fireplace in each, glass in the windows, a servant, or several, sometimes enslaved, to help with the cooking and cleaning, and access to imported goods from Britain and the Caribbean that made her daily life physically comfortable by the standards of the time. 3 streets away, in a tenement room above a cooperage, a recently arrived German or Irish laborer might be sharing a single room with his wife, 3 children, and another family entirely. The room would be dark. The floor would be dirt or rough wood. Heat would come from a small fire that cost money to maintain. Food would be whatever was cheapest in the market that week, which in winter was not much. The children of both families might play in the same street. They would not attend the same schools, attend the same churches, sit in the same sections of those churches, or have any reasonable expectation of ending up in the same position in society as each other. The city held them all. The city did not treat them equally. The market was the great equalizer of colonial New York, at least in the sense that it was the place where different classes and communities encountered each other in the same physical space. The Fly Market, which stood near what is now Fulton Street in Lower Manhattan, was for much of the 18th century the center of the city's food trade, and the Fly Market was extraordinary in its variety. Farmers from Long Island and New Jersey came by boat and ferry to sell produce. Fishermen brought the morning's catch. Butchers operated their stalls. Bakers brought bread. Enslaved men and women, sent by their enslavers to buy or sell goods, moved through the same market alongside free people of various races and backgrounds. The Lenape and other indigenous people, whose presence in the city was gradually diminishing as land dispossession accelerated, but who had not disappeared, occasionally traded at the market. Dutch, English, German, French, Portuguese, and a dozen other languages mixed in the noise of the stalls. The smells were extraordinary. Fish and bread and horse and mud and spices from the Caribbean and whatever the Hudson had decided to contribute to the atmosphere that day. If you could stand in the Fly Market on a Tuesday morning in 1740 and just listen, just stand still and listen, you would hear something that would sound in its multilingual, economically stratified, sensory overloaded way, recognizably like New York. Different words, same energy, same beautiful, exhausting, magnificent chaos. The question of illness in colonial New York is one that deserves both honesty and a certain gentle handling. Disease was a constant companion of life in the city. Yellow fever epidemics swept through New York repeatedly in the late 17th and 18th centuries. The 1702 epidemic killed somewhere around 10% of the city's population. The outbreaks returned in 1731, 1742, 1745, and again in the 1790s, when a particularly severe epidemic killed hundreds in a city that had not yet fully processed the experience of becoming the first capital of the new nation. Smallpox was endemic. Dysentery was common. Tuberculosis, called consumption then, a name that captures something about what the disease does to a body, was a slow presence in the city's life, particularly among the poor and the overcrowded. Childbirth was dangerous. Infant mortality was devastating by modern standards. A family that had 5 children and raised 4 to adulthood was considered fortunate, and yet people made plans. People fell in love. People argued about politics in taverns. People planted gardens in spring with genuine hope that the summer would be good. People celebrated the new year and complained about the summer heat and had their specific opinions about their neighbors. The fear of death was present in a way that is hard to fully imagine from the vantage point of a world with vaccines and antibiotics. And yet, people lived with a fullness that fear of death sometimes produces in people who understand, viscerally, that time is not guaranteed. Children in colonial New York had, by our standards, very little childhood. In laboring families, children began contributing economically from very young ages. A boy of 8 or 9 might be apprenticed to a craftsman, a carpenter, a cobbler, a printer, and would spend years learning a trade through work, not school. Girls learned domestic skills, cooking, sewing, household management, which were not considered lesser skills at the time, but were rather understood as the foundation of household economy, which was genuinely a complex and demanding set of competencies. Formal schooling existed but was not universal and was not free. The children of wealthy families had tutors or attended private schools. The children of laboring families learned what they could from wherever they could and spent most of their days working. The idea of childhood as a protected space of play and development is, historically speaking, a relatively recent invention, which does not mean that children in colonial New York did not play. They did. They played in the streets, in the alleyways, along the waterfront. They skated on the frozen ponds in winter. They swam in the rivers in summer, probably not in the cleanest water imaginable, but with the absolute indifference to hygiene that children have always demonstrated when given the choice between clean water and fun water. They were children. They were alive in a city that was alive. And they grew up into adults who built the next layer of the city, which was then built upon by their children, layer upon layer, generation upon generation, all the way down to the bedrock, and all the way up to whatever is currently being constructed on the skyline. The daily rhythm of the city in the 18th century was governed by sound, in a way we have largely lost. There were no electric lights. There were no mechanical clocks in every room. There were no phones telling you what time it was. Time was marked by church bells, by the movement of the sun, by the calls of vendors in the street, the fish seller, the bread seller, the knife grinder, each of whom had their own distinctive call that regular residents learned to recognize the way we recognized the sound of a notification from a specific app. The city woke early, before sunrise in many cases, because daylight was precious and expensive to replicate with candles or oil lamps. The city went to sleep not long after dark because staying up required fuel and light, which cost money. The night was different from what we experience. Darker, more audible, the sounds of a city in the dark, the watch calling the hours, the creak of ships at the docks, the wind off the river, the occasional argument. These sounds were the soundtrack of a night without artificial light. Looking up at the night sky from Manhattan in 1750, you would have seen the Milky Way. You would have seen the full depth of the night sky without any light pollution. The same sky that the Lenape had navigated by, now watched by Dutch and English and African and German and Irish and Jewish eyes in a city that had been, in all its complexity and cruelty and vitality, growing for over a century. The same stars, different city, same human impulse to look up at night and feel the specific smallness that the stars have always reliably produced. There is one object that runs through the entire history of New York, like a thread pulled from the very beginning to the very recent past. It is not the Statue of Liberty. It is not the skyscraper. It is not the yellow taxi or the subway token or the hot dog from a cart on a midtown street corner. It is the oyster. And the oyster, if you follow it carefully through New York's history, turns out to be one of the most eloquent symbols of everything the city was, everything it became, and everything it lost. We touched on this briefly when we were discussing the Lenape. The oyster beds of New York Harbor were by any measure extraordinary. Naturalists and explorers who visited the region in the 16th and 17th centuries described oyster beds that stretched across enormous areas of the harbor floor. Some beds were several feet thick. The oysters themselves were large. Some historical accounts describe oysters the length of a forearm, which sounds like the kind of exaggeration that grows with retelling, but which archaeological evidence partially supports. The harbor was, in the language of modern ecology, phenomenally productive, and the Lenape had understood this and used it for thousands of years. The shell middens we discussed earlier, those ancient accumulations of discarded oyster shells, were not just evidence of meals. They were evidence of a relationship, a seasonal, careful, multi-generational relationship between a community of people and a specific living resource. The Lenape harvested oysters in a way that maintained the beds. They did not take everything. They understood, in the practical way of people who depend on a resource over generations, that the resource must be allowed to sustain itself. The shell middens, in their layered accumulation over centuries, are actually evidence of sustainable harvesting, evidence of restraint, evidence of a relationship with the natural world that was managed, not simply extracted. When the Dutch and then the English arrived, the oyster remained central to daily life in the settlement. For the poor and the laboring classes of New Amsterdam and colonial New York, oysters were food, simple, abundant, cheap food. The harbor provided them in such quantities that they were essentially free for the taking. Oyster sellers worked the streets of lower Manhattan, selling from carts and barrows. Oyster sellers, taverns and eating houses specializing in oysters, became one of the characteristic institutions of New York street life. By the 18th century, oysters were so associated with New York that they were being shipped to other colonial cities in barrels. New York oysters went to Philadelphia, to Boston. Eventually, as the trade grew, to London. The oyster was one of New York's first major exports, which means that New York was, in a very literal sense, built partly on the oyster. In the 19th century, the oyster had its great cultural moment in New York. As the city's populations exploded, from 60,000 in 1800 to over 300,000 by 1840 to over 1 million by 1880, the oyster became the food of the city in a way that cut across class lines in a manner that very few foods in history have managed. The wealthy ate oysters at elegant oyster saloons, served on ice with lemon and fine wine, as an expression of sophisticated taste. The working class ate oysters from street carts for a penny apiece, standing on a cold corner in winter, as a quick, filling meal that cost almost nothing. The same food, completely different experiences of it, but the same oyster. This is the thing about the oyster in New York history. It was, for a long time, genuinely democratic in its availability, even as it was socially stratified in its presentation. You could be a millionaire or a dock worker, and both of you were eating New York Harbor oysters. That is unusual in the history of food. That is worth noting. And then the oyster almost disappeared. By the late 19th century, the combination of industrial pollution pouring into the harbor, the dumping of raw sewage into the same waters that the oyster beds occupied, and the sheer scale of harvesting in an era before any conservation consciousness had developed. All of this collapsed the oyster population. By around 1906, New York harbor oysters were declared unsafe to eat. The beds that had sustained Lenape communities for thousands of years, that had fed Dutch settlers and colonial New Yorkers and immigrants from 100 countries were gone, contaminated, destroyed, lost. It happened faster than anyone who had grown up eating penny oysters on a street corner could quite believe. The harbor that had once been one of the most productive estuarine environments on the Atlantic coast was now one of the most polluted bodies of water near any major city in the world. The oyster went from being the symbol of New York's abundance to being a symbol of what abundance costs when you stop paying attention to it. There is a quiet epilogue to the oyster story that I want to end this chapter with, because it is genuinely hopeful in a way that New York sometimes manages to be when you least expect it. In recent decades, a project called the Billion Oyster Project has been working to restore oyster reefs to New York Harbor. The logic is not primarily gastronomic. You cannot eat these oysters yet. The harbor is still not clean enough for that. The logic is ecological. Because oysters filter water, a single adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day, removing nitrogen, sediment, and pollution from the water column, restore the oysters, and the oysters begin to restore the harbor. As of the time this script was written, millions of oysters have been reintroduced to New York Harbor through this project, with the long-term goal of reaching 1 billion oysters. In the same harbor where the Lenape ate from shell beds thousands of years thick, in the same harbor where Dutch settlers first tasted the particular sweetness of a New York oyster on a cold morning in the 17th century, in the same harbor where immigrants arrived by the millions and looked up at a copper statue with a torch raised against the sky. The oyster was there before the city, and it may, if we are careful enough this time, be there long after us. Every city presents a version of itself to the world, a face. New York's face, the one on the postcard, the one in the movie, the one that gets exported around the world and becomes the image that millions of people carry in their minds, is a face of energy and possibility and openness, the city of reinvention, the place where you can become someone new. And there is truth in that face, there genuinely is. But faces are the parts of people they choose to show. Behind the face of New York, running through every period of its history, is a set of social divides so persistent and so structurally embedded that they function less like historical accidents and more like design features. Not intentional design, necessarily, but design in the sense that certain outcomes were built into the structure of the city in ways that required active effort to change and that often reasserted themselves even after that effort was made. Tonight, let us look at a few of those divides. The first and most fundamental divide in New York's history is the one between the people who owned property and the people who did not. In the colonial period, this was essentially the difference between full civic participation and none. Under British colonial law, only property owners could vote. Only property owners could hold certain offices. Only property owners had the legal standing to make certain kinds of claims. And property ownership in New York was, from a very early period, concentrated in ways that were not accidental. The Dutch West India Company had granted enormous tracts of land to a small number of favored individuals under a system called the patroonship. A patroon received a large land grant in exchange for bringing settlers to the colony. In theory, this would spread people across the territory. In practice, it created a small class of enormously wealthy landowners and a much larger class of tenant farmers who worked land they would never own. The patroon system was officially abolished after the British takeover, but the underlying pattern, large land grants to well-connected individuals, a class of people with access to land versus a class of people without, persisted through British rule and into the American period. The great landholding families of colonial New York, the Van Cortlandts, the Livingstons, the Phillipses, held vast estates up the Hudson Valley and exercised political and economic power that their tenants simply could not match. The Revolution, which was partly fought in the name of equality, did not fundamentally redistribute this land. The estates remained, the tenants remained, the divide remained. Now let us talk about the divide that is the most uncomfortable and the most consequential, and which we have touched on already, but which deserves its own moment of direct attention. Race. New York was a slave city. We have said this already, but let us stay with it a little longer, because the daily reality of what this meant for the people who lived it is something that tends to get acknowledged abstractly and then quickly moved past. By 1703, 40% of all households in New York City included enslaved people. 40%. That is not a marginal footnote. That is a foundational social fact about what the city was. Enslaved people in New York did not generally work on large agricultural plantations the way the popular image of American slavery often suggests. New York's enslaved population worked in households, in trades, on the docks, in the construction of the city's buildings and infrastructure. They built the city, in a very literal sense. They built walls and laid streets, and loaded and unloaded ships, and cooked food, and raised children who were not theirs and lived in conditions of complete legal vulnerability, where their families could be separated at any moment, where their children were born into the same status, where no legal protection existed for their bodies, or their relationships, or their futures. In 1712, enslaved people in New York organized an armed uprising. About 23 enslaved men set fire to a building in Lower Manhattan and attacked the colonists who came to put out the fire. 9 white colonists were killed. The response was swift and brutal. More than 20 enslaved people were executed. The methods of execution were designed to be as public and terrifying as possible. In 1741, a second alleged conspiracy, sometimes called the New York Conspiracy of 1741, though historians debate how organized it actually was versus how much it reflected white panic, led to the execution of 34 people, both black and white, in a wave of violence that reveals as much about the fears of the slaveholding class as it does about any actual plot. 17 black men were hanged. 13 black men were burned at the stake. In New York City. In the 18th century, that is in the history. That is not in the postcard. The gender divide in New York's history deserves attention too, and it is one that contains a few surprises. In the Dutch period, Dutch law actually gave women somewhat more legal standing than English law would later allow. A Dutch legal concept called manus marriage meant that some women retained certain property rights within marriage that English common law's doctrine of coverture under which a married woman's legal existence was essentially absorbed into her husband's, would later eliminate. When the British took over in 1664 and English law replaced Dutch law, women in New York lost legal ground. Widows retained some rights. Unmarried women of means had limited legal standing. But a married woman, under coverture, could not sign contracts, could not own property in her own name, could not sue or be sued independently. She was legally a dependent of her husband. And yet the historical record, read carefully, is full of women who exercised enormous practical power within these legal constraints. Women ran businesses in their husbands' names. Women managed households that were, in economic terms, complex enterprises. Women organized charitable and religious institutions. Women negotiated in markets and managed resources and made decisions that shaped the trajectory of their families with or without legal recognition of their capacity to do so. The law said one thing. The actual texture of daily life said something more complicated, as it usually does. The urban versus rural divide is one that shaped New York's relationship with the rest of New York State throughout the 19th century and beyond. New York City, from a relatively early period, was in tension with the rest of the state that shared its name. The city was commercial, cosmopolitan, dense, immigrant, and democratic in its politics for much of the 19th century. Upstate New York was agricultural, Protestant, more Anglo-Saxon in its demographic composition, and often Republican. The two New Yorks looked at each other across the Hudson Valley with a mixture of economic dependency and cultural suspicion that has not entirely resolved itself even now. The city needed the food and resources that came from upstate. Upstate needed the market that the city provided. They needed each other the way people sometimes need each other while simultaneously finding each other completely baffling. And then there is the divide within the immigrant community itself. Because the story of immigration to New York is not a simple story of the huddled masses arriving together in solidarity. It is a story of group after group arriving at the bottom of a social hierarchy and working their way up by distinguishing themselves from the group that arrived after them. The Irish, who faced enormous discrimination in the 1840s and 1850s, the No Irish Need Apply signs in windows, the political cartoons depicting them as subhuman, the casual violence of a society that did not want them, the Irish, once they had established themselves in the city's political and labor structures, did not always welcome the next group with open arms. The same pattern repeated across groups. Italians, who were not always considered fully white in the racial taxonomy of 19th century America. Eastern European Jews, who were viewed with suspicion by the already established German Jewish community that had arrived earlier. Puerto Rican migrants, who arrived in large numbers after World War II into a city that had a complex and often hostile relationship with their presence. Each group arriving, each group surviving, each group eventually building enough community and political power to hold some ground. Each group then, in various ways, and to various degrees, participating in the same social dynamics that had been applied to them. The city of reinvention. The city where you can become someone new, yes, but you become someone new within a structure that was already there. And the structure has always had a very specific opinion about where the newest arrivals are supposed to stand. The miracle of New York is not that the structure did not exist. It is that so many people, across so many generations, found ways to live inside it and around it, and sometimes, in moments of extraordinary human stubbornness, to change it. There is a belief that sits at the very center of New York's mythology, a belief so deeply embedded that it feels less like a historical claim and more like a law of nature. The belief is this: New York was always destined to be the greatest city in America. The harbor made it inevitable. The geography guaranteed it. The whole thing was written into the landscape from the beginning, and every chapter of the city's growth was simply the unfolding of an obvious predetermined conclusion. This is the story New York tells about itself. It is also, in a very specific and important sense, wrong. Not wrong in every detail. The harbor is genuinely extraordinary. The geography is genuinely advantageous. But destiny, inevitability, those are stories that winners tell about themselves after they have already won. And the actual history of how New York became dominant is a history of accidents, near misses, catastrophic fires, political battles that could easily have gone the other way, and at least one moment in the 19th century when the city came genuinely close to being financially destroyed rather than financially dominant. Let us pull this apart carefully. First, the fire. On the night of December 16, 1835, a fire broke out in a warehouse in Lower Manhattan. It was an exceptionally cold night. The East River had partially frozen. The water in the fire hoses froze before it could be used. Firefighters from as far as Philadelphia were summoned, but arrived too late to do much of anything useful. By the time the fire burned itself out, it had destroyed somewhere between 600 and 700 buildings in the heart of New York's commercial district. 600 to 700 buildings in one night. The financial losses were staggering. Most of the insurance companies that had insured those buildings went bankrupt almost immediately because the scale of the disaster exceeded anything the insurance market had been designed to handle. The city that was supposedly destined for greatness was, in December of 1835, a smoking ruin at its commercial core with a bankrupted insurance sector and a merchant class that had lost enormous portions of its accumulated wealth overnight and then. And this is the part that is genuinely extraordinary. The city rebuilt, not slowly, not reluctantly, fast. Within 2 years, the burned district had been almost entirely reconstructed, largely with brick and stone rather than the wood that had burned so efficiently, and the commercial life of Lower Manhattan was operating at a level that exceeded what it had been before the fire. The Great Fire of 1835 is not, in the popular version of New York history, a story about near disaster. It has been reframed over time as a story about resilience, which it is, but it is also a story about how close the whole thing came to going very differently. Destiny is often just survival rebranded. Second, the genuinely contested moment. Here is something that is taught almost nowhere in the standard version of New York history. In the early 19th century, it was not at all clear that New York City would emerge as the dominant American city. Philadelphia was older, more established, and had been the national capital. It had better cultural institutions and a more developed professional class. Baltimore had a natural harbor and strong commercial connections to the interior. Boston had the oldest educational institutions, the most developed literary and intellectual culture, and a commercial network that stretched around the world. New York had the harbor and the ambition and a certain chaotic energy, but ambition and chaotic energy are not sufficient by themselves. What changed everything was, as we discussed in Chapter 4, the Erie Canal. But here is the part that does not get enough emphasis. The Erie Canal was not inevitable either. When DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York who championed the canal project, first proposed it, it was mocked so extensively and so publicly that critics called it Clinton's folly and Clinton's ditch. The federal government refused to fund it. The project moved forward on state financing and on Clinton's almost stubborn refusal to accept that it was a bad idea. If Clinton had been a less stubborn man, if the New York State Legislature had been slightly less willing to take the financial risk, if any of a dozen contingent political and financial decisions had gone differently, the canal might not have been built, or it might have been built by a different state, connecting a different city to the interior. The destiny of New York as America's commercial capital was in reality a bet. A very good bet made by people with good reasons to make it, but a bet nonetheless, not a guarantee written into the geology. Third, and this one requires a moment of scholarly honesty, because historians genuinely debate the details. The name changing at Ellis Island. This is one of the most persistent myths in American immigration history, and it survives partly because it is emotionally resonant, and partly because it contains a kernel of something true, even though the specific claim is not accurate. The myth goes like this. Immigrants arrived at Ellis Island. They told officials their names. The officials, unable to pronounce or spell the foreign names, wrote down whatever they felt like, and that is how Kowalski became Kelly, and Rosenbaum became Ross, and so on. The problem with this story is that Ellis Island officials did not actually write down immigrants' names from scratch. Immigrants arriving at Ellis Island in the main period of operation were checked against ship manifests. passenger lists that had already been completed, usually by shipping company officials, at the port of departure in Europe. The names were already written down before the immigrants arrived. Ellis Island inspectors were checking people against existing lists, not creating new records. Name changes did happen, but they happened more commonly through a different process, and for different reasons. Immigrants themselves sometimes changed their names, voluntarily, deliberately, after arrival in America, to sound more American, to avoid discrimination, to start fresh with an identity that would be easier to carry in a country where your original name marked you immediately as foreign. The name change was often an act of the immigrant, not an act of an indifferent bureaucrat, which is arguably a more complicated and more interesting story than the bureaucratic blunder version. It is a story about the cost of belonging, about what people were willing to give up, including something as intimate as the name their parents gave them, in exchange for the possibility of being accepted in a new place. That is worth knowing correctly, because knowing it correctly changes what it means. It makes it sadder and more human and more about choice under pressure, rather than just a clerical error. Fourth, and finally for this chapter, the Tammany Hall myth. Tammany Hall, the Democratic Party political machine that dominated New York City politics for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, is remembered primarily as a story of corruption, and it was corrupt. Genuinely, extensively, creatively corrupt. Boss Tweed, who ran the Tammany machine in the 1860s and early 1870s, and his associates stole somewhere between $30 million and $200 million from the city treasury. The range of that estimate, 30 to 200 million, is itself a testament to how thoroughly the books were cooked. But the popular version of Tammany Hall stops at corruption and does not continue to the part of the story that explains why Tammany Hall survived for as long as it did and why ordinary working people, including enormous numbers of immigrants, supported it. Tammany Hall delivered things, real things, tangible things. When a newly arrived Irish immigrant needed a job, Tammany could provide one. When a family needed coal in winter and could not afford it, Tammany provided it. When someone needed help navigating the legal system of a country whose language they barely spoke and whose institutions were not designed with them in mind, Tammany provided a ward boss who spoke your language and knew how the system worked and could make things happen. In exchange, you voted the way Tammany told you to vote. It was transactional, it was corrupt. It was also, for many people, the only functional social welfare system available to them in a city that did not yet have the formal institutions to provide what they needed. Tammany Hall was not just a corruption story. It was a story about what happens when people who need help cannot get it from legitimate institutions and turn instead to whoever will actually show up. That is a story with more contemporary resonance than the textbook version allows. Every city has its rituals, the things it does again and again, year after year, generation after generation, until the repetition itself becomes a form of identity. New York, perhaps more than any other city in the world, has accumulated rituals the way the harbor accumulated oyster shells, layer by layer, over centuries, each layer resting on the one before it, building something thicker and more complex than any single layer could suggest. Some of these rituals are famous, some are quiet, some began as something completely different from what they are now. All of them tell us something true about what the city believes about itself. Let us begin with the oldest ritual that has any continuity into the present, the market day. We discussed the fly market of the colonial period, but the practice of gathering in a specific place at a specific time to buy and sell food. This is so old in New York that it predates the European settlement entirely. The Lenape had regular trading gatherings, specific places at specific times of year where goods were exchanged between communities. The Dutch market days continued that geographic logic, if not its original cultural meaning, and the tradition has never stopped. The farmers' markets that operate in parks and plazas across New York City today, the famous one at Union Square, which has operated since 1976, and dozens of others across the boroughs, are in a direct line of descent that nobody planned and everybody participates in, a continuation of a practice that has been happening in this specific place for thousands of years. people gathering, food changing hands, the seasonal availability of things, strawberries in June, apples in September, root vegetables in winter, marking the rhythm of the year. The market as ritual, the market as calendar. The New Year's celebration in New York has a particular history that is worth tracing. The Times Square ball drop, which has become one of the most globally broadcast rituals in the world, began in 1907. The Times Square area itself had only recently become the center it is now. The New York Times had moved its headquarters there in 1904, and the area around it had developed quickly into an entertainment and commercial district. The 1907 ball drop replaced an earlier New Year's tradition at the Times building which had involved fireworks, discontinued due to fire safety concerns. The ball itself, lowered from a flagpole on the roof of what was then the Times Tower, weighed 700 pounds and was covered in 100 electric light bulbs. It has been lowered every year since, with one exception. In 1942 and 1943, during World War II, the ball drop was suspended because of wartime blackout regulations that prohibited bright lights in coastal cities as a fascist defense against potential enemy air attacks. New York City observed New Year's Eve in those 2 years in silence and in darkness. The crowd still gathered in Times Square. They stood in the dark. They listened for the bells of nearby churches which were permitted to ring, and they counted down the year together in the dark, because the ritual mattered enough that removing the light was not sufficient reason to remove the gathering. The gathering is the ritual. The ball is just something to watch. The ticker tape parade is a New York ritual that was not invented on purpose. On October 28, 1886, the Statue of Liberty was dedicated in a ceremony that included a parade through Lower Manhattan. The financial district workers in the tall buildings along the parade route. Buildings that were, by this period, beginning to scrape several stories into the sky, leaned out of their windows and threw things. What they threw was ticker tape, the thin paper strips that came continuously out of the stock ticker machines, that every financial office used to receive market information. The machines produced a continuous supply of paper that, once read, was useless. On October 28, 1886, someone in a window above Broadway decided to throw some of it, and then everyone decided to throw some of it, and the first ticker tape parade happened entirely by accident, driven by the simple human impulse to throw something joyful out of a window at something celebratory passing below. New York has since held over 200 official ticker tape parades, honoring everyone from returning war heroes to astronauts to championship sports teams. The actual ticker tape machines are long gone, but the city still produces the paper strips for parades because the ritual has outlasted the technology that accidentally created it. The ritual of the neighborhood itself is one that deserves a moment of attention because it is perhaps the most distinctively New York of all the city's repetitive practices. In most cities, you live in a city. In New York, you live in a neighborhood. And the neighborhood has its own identity, its own character, its own institutions, the specific diner on the corner, the particular park where people gather in summer, the church or synagogue or mosque that anchors the block, the bodega owner who knows your order before you say it. That function as a micro-ritual system within the larger city. This neighborhood identity is itself a historical product. The concentration of specific immigrant groups in specific neighborhoods, the Lower East Side is the Jewish neighborhood, Little Italy, Chinatown, Harlem as the center of Black New York, the various waves of Caribbean and Latin American communities in the Bronx and Brooklyn. These concentrations were partly a product of discrimination, of people being steered or excluded from other areas. But they were also a product of the human need for familiarity in an unfamiliar place. When you arrive in a city where you do not speak the language and do not know the customs and do not understand the institutions, you go where you hear your own language spoken, where the food smells familiar, where the religious practice you grew up with is available. You create a neighborhood, and then the neighborhood creates you, and then your children grow up in it and partly leave it and carry it with them wherever they go, and it becomes a piece of their identity even after the neighborhood itself has changed around them. The neighborhood as ritual, the neighborhood as inherited identity. the neighborhood as the city's most human-scaled form of repetition. There is a sleep rhythm to New York that I want to mention here, because it is relevant to where you are right now. The phrase, "the city that never sleeps." It is one of the most famous descriptions of New York in existence. And it is, like most famous descriptions, true in a surface way and more complicated underneath. New York does not sleep in the sense that there is always something happening somewhere. The subway runs 24 hours. The bodegas are open. The diners are open. The hospitals are staffed. The nightclubs are open. The delivery trucks are moving through the streets in the pre-dawn hours. But New York also sleeps. 8 million people sleep in New York every night. They sleep in apartments stacked on top of each other, 20 floors high. They sleep in brownstones in Brooklyn, and houses in Staten Island, and basements in the Bronx. They sleep through the subway noise, and the sirens, and the sound of their neighbors' television, and the garbage trucks at 4 in the morning, and the birds that somehow find their way into the city and sing at 5. New York sleeps the way the city does everything else, loudly, imperfectly, surrounded by other people doing the same thing in their own way. And every morning, it wakes up and starts again, which is itself a kind of ritual, the daily recommitment to the project of being a city, of being specifically this city. Let us talk about what it actually cost, not in money, not in the economic sense that the history books tend to measure, in the body, in the physical, biological, daily reality of what it meant to live in New York City across the centuries. Because the city has always been, simultaneously, one of the most exciting places a human being could choose to inhabit, and one of the most physically demanding. And for the people at the bottom of its social structure, it was not always a choice. It was simply where they were. And they survived it, or they did not with the resources available to them. The body in colonial New York faced threats that we have largely forgotten how to be afraid of. Smallpox. Let us begin there, because smallpox shaped New York's history in ways that go far beyond medicine. Smallpox epidemics swept through the city repeatedly in the 17th and 18th centuries. The disease was devastating in its speed and its scale, and it fell with particular brutality on communities that had no prior exposure and therefore no partial immunity. The indigenous peoples of the New York region, the Lenape, the Munsee, the Canarsie, all of the communities that had been living in this landscape for thousands of years, were catastrophically affected by smallpox and other European diseases. Some historians and epidemiologists estimate that disease killed between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Northeast in the century following sustained European contact. That is not a clean, fast death. That is villages watching their elders and their children die faster than the survivors can process the grief. It is communities losing the people who held the knowledge, the specific, accumulated, generational knowledge of how to live in this particular landscape before that knowledge could be passed on. It is the end of a world, conducted not primarily through warfare or conquest, though those were real, but through the invisible mechanism of biological catastrophe. And the colonists who arrived to fill the depopulated land sometimes interpreted its emptiness as evidence that it had always been empty, when in fact they were looking at the aftermath of a catastrophe so large it had no precedent in human memory. For the European settlers and later the immigrant populations, smallpox was also a constant and terrifying presence. The development of inoculation, a precursor to vaccination in which material from a mild smallpox case was introduced into a healthy person to induce immunity, was a genuine medical revolution, and New York was one of the sites of early American debate about it. During a smallpox epidemic in Boston in 1721, a minister named Cotton Mather and a physician named Zabdiel Boylston had promoted inoculation based on knowledge that an enslaved African man named Onesimus had shared, knowledge of a practice that had been used in parts of Africa and the Ottoman Empire for generations. The knowledge that saved lives during that epidemic came from an enslaved man. His name deserves to be in this history. By the time Edward Jenner developed the cowpox-based vaccine in 1796, New York's medical community was ready to adopt it. The city established one of the earliest vaccination programs in America in the early 19th century. But vaccination was not universal. It was not free. It was not equally accessible. The poor, who were the most crowded, the most exposed, the most vulnerable, were also the least likely to have reliable access to protection. Disease in New York, as everywhere, was not an equal opportunity killer. It followed the fault lines of poverty and crowding with a consistency that should have made the connection obvious to everyone watching, and sometimes it did. The cholera epidemic of 1832 was the moment when the connection between poverty, crowding, sanitation, and disease became impossible for even the most comfortable New Yorkers to ignore. Cholera arrived in New York in June of 1832. It killed approximately 3,500 people in a matter of months in a city of about 250,000. It killed them primarily in the poorest, most crowded neighborhoods. The 5 Points area, a notoriously overcrowded slum neighborhood in Lower Manhattan that has become something of a historical shorthand for 19th century urban poverty, was devastated. The wealthy fled to the countryside as they had during previous epidemics. The poor could not flee. They stayed because they had nowhere else to go and no money to get there, and they died at rates that shocked even a city that had learned to be somewhat fatalistic about disease. The cholera epidemic of 1832 was the event that, more than almost any other single moment, pushed New York toward the development of a real public health infrastructure. It took time. It took several more epidemics. It took decades of advocacy from reformers and physicians and journalists. But the cholera epidemic was the moment when enough people in power understood that the health of the poorest New Yorkers was not separable from the health of the city as a whole. That disease does not stop at the boundary of a wealthy neighborhood, that the body of the city is one body, even when the city does not want to believe that. The physical labor that built New York is another chapter in the body's history here. The construction of the Erie Canal involved thousands of workers, mostly Irish immigrants, many of whom had arrived in America with almost nothing and took the most dangerous, lowest paid work available. Canal digging was brutal. Workers dug with hand tools through terrain that ranged from soft earth to solid rock. They worked in standing water that bred mosquitoes and the malaria that mosquitoes carried. They worked through summers that were brutally hot and winters that should have shut construction down, but often did not because the financial pressure to finish was relentless. They died in accidents. They died from disease. They died from the simple accumulated damage of physical labor performed in dangerous conditions without adequate rest or nutrition. The Erie Canal is remembered as a triumph of American engineering. It was also a graveyard for the men who built it. Their bodies are in the landscape of New York State in the most literal possible sense. The construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, which was completed in 1883, has a similar history. The Brooklyn Bridge is one of the most beautiful structures ever built by human hands. It is also a monument to what human bodies went through to build it. The construction required workers to spend time in pressurized caissons, enormous wooden boxes sunk to the riverbed to allow workers to excavate the foundation in conditions that nobody yet fully understood were dangerous. Workers coming up too quickly from the pressurized environment of the caissons developed what was then called caisson disease and what we now call decompression sickness or the bends. It causes extreme joint pain, it causes paralysis, it causes death. The chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge project, Washington Roebling, himself developed such severe caisson disease during construction that he was partially paralyzed and was unable to visit the construction site for much of the project. He directed construction from his apartment window across the river using binoculars. His wife, Emily Warren Roebling, became the primary day-to-day manager of the construction project, communicating her husband's instructions to the workers, learning enough about engineering to understand and convey complex technical decisions, and navigating a construction world that had never imagined a woman in her role. She was the first person to cross the completed Brooklyn Bridge. She crossed it carrying a rooster, which was a symbol of victory. The workers who built the bridge with their bodies, who descended into the caissons and came up too fast and spent the rest of their lives in pain, most of their names are not recorded. 27 workers died during construction. Their names are in some records. Their bodies built the bridge that became the symbol of the city's ambition. there is one more thread in the body's history of New York that deserves a quiet moment. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of March 25, 1911. 146 workers died in that fire. Most of them were young women, immigrant women, Italian and Jewish women, many of them teenagers, who worked in a garment factory on the upper floors of a building in Greenwich Village. The fire spread through the factory with terrible speed. The doors to the stairwells were locked. The owners locked them during working hours, ostensibly to prevent workers from taking unauthorized breaks or stealing fabric. The fire escape collapsed. Workers who could not escape the flames jumped from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. The sidewalk below received them. People watching from the street watched them fall. 146 people in one afternoon in a building in the middle of the city. The Triangle Fire became the moment that forced the transformation of American labor law. It led directly to a wave of workplace safety legislation in New York State and eventually across the country. It led to the strengthening of the labor movement. It led to laws about fire exits and sprinkler systems and door locks and working hours and 100 other specific protections that people who go to work today benefit from without knowing why those protections exist. They exist because of 146 people, most of them young, most of them women, most of them immigrants, all of them gone in an afternoon. Their bodies wrote the safety codes that are still in the walls of the buildings you enter today. That is what survival costs in a city. That is what it takes sometimes to make a city safe. Not a law passed in comfort, but a catastrophe witnessed, and the determination, painful and slow and imperfect, to make sure it does not happen again. There is a New York City that exists in the collective imagination of people who have never been there, and there is New York City. And the relationship between those two things is one of the more fascinating distortions in modern cultural history, because the imaginary New York is not simply wrong. It is based on something real, but it is based on a very specific selection of real things, repeated so many times and in so many formats that the selection has come to feel like the whole. And the parts that were left out, which are the parts where most of the actual people actually live, have become, somehow, the parts that do not count as the real New York, even to people who live in them. Let us start with the movies. New York has been filmed more than almost any city on Earth. From the earliest silent films through the great Hollywood studio era, through the independent film explosion of the 1970s and the blockbuster era that followed. New York has been on screen continuously for over a century, and the New York that cinema constructed is a very specific New York. It is primarily Manhattan. More specifically, it is primarily a relatively small section of Manhattan, roughly from the Brooklyn Bridge to Central Park, with particular emphasis on certain neighborhoods that photograph well and carry certain cultural associations. The Upper West Side of Woody Allen films, the Lower East Side of gangster pictures, Greenwich Village of folk music and bohemian romance, Midtown of ambition and power suits. Brooklyn was mostly absent from the cinematic New York until relatively recently, when it became fashionable enough for filmmakers to notice. The Bronx appeared primarily in disaster narratives. Queens appeared when filmmakers needed an airport. Staten Island was mostly forgotten, which Staten Islanders will tell you is a pattern they have come to expect. The cinematic New York produced a mental image that even New Yorkers internalized. A city of yellow cabs and steam from underground grates and Art Deco skyscrapers glimpsed from below. A city where interesting things happen to articulate people in large apartments that no one who works the jobs those characters supposedly work could actually afford. The apartment problem in fictional New York is its own remarkable genre of unreality. Characters who are supposedly struggling writers or junior teachers or entry-level anything inhabit apartments that, in the real New York, would cost several $1,000s a month. Friends, the television series, ran for 10 years on the premise that 6 young adults in their 20s lived in large, beautifully decorated apartments in Greenwich Village on entry-level salaries. The show acknowledged this was improbable by making one apartment rent-controlled and another inherited, but the physical scale of the apartments was never quite explained. Because the actual apartments that those characters would realistically have occupied were too small and too dim and too close to the neighbors to be funny in the way the writers needed them to be funny. The real New York apartment, the one that is smaller than the set of any show that depicts a New York apartment, was left on the cutting room floor. The romanticization of certain historical periods in New York has produced some particularly persistent distortions. The 1920s jazz age New York of the popular imagination, the speakeasies and the flappers and the Great Gatsby glamour, was real in the sense that those things existed. But they existed alongside a New York that was also experiencing intense racial violence, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in its national resurgence, severe immigration restriction laws passed in 1924 that specifically targeted Southern and Eastern Europeans and effectively shut the door on the kind of mass immigration that had defined the city for the previous 50 years, and a housing crisis that made the tenement conditions of the previous generation look only marginally improved. The Jazz Age glitters in the cultural memory. The Immigration Act of 1924, which would have kept most of the grandparents of the people watching those Gatsby adaptations from ever arriving in the country, does not make it into the party scenes. Similarly, the 1950s New York of mid-century nostalgia, the diners and the Brooklyn Dodgers and the clean streets, and the sense of a city in its confident prime, was also the New York of massive racial discrimination in housing, the systematic exclusion of black New Yorkers from the suburban housing boom that was reshaping the rest of the metropolitan area, and the beginning of the urban disinvestment that would culminate in the devastation of the 1970s. The nostalgia selects the chrome countertops and forgets the redlining. The branding of New York is its own industry, and it has produced some remarkable examples of commercial mythology. The I Love New York campaign, with its iconic heart logo, designed by Milton Glaser in 1977, was created specifically as a response to the fiscal crisis and the perception that New York was dangerous, ungovernable, and undesirable. It was a marketing campaign, a desperate marketing campaign, created at a moment when the city was genuinely struggling to convince people that it was worth visiting, and it worked so completely that the logo became, within a generation, synonymous with the city itself. It was copied everywhere. Every city with a tourism problem eventually produced its own version of the heart logo and the four-letter declaration. New York had accidentally invented the template for municipal branding. The logo Milton Glaser designed on a piece of paper in the back of a taxi, he has told this story himself, became one of the most reproduced graphic designs in human history. He was paid nothing for it initially because he considered it a civic contribution, which is the kind of story that New York produces regularly. The thing that defines the city forever, created in the back of a cab, for free. The internet has done something interesting to New York's cultural afterlife. It has simultaneously expanded the city's global reach and flattened its complexity into a set of instantly recognizable signals. The New York aesthetic, the specific visual and cultural language that says New York without needing to say New York, has been packaged and exported and imitated in ways that have made the city simultaneously more universally known and more superficially understood than at any previous point in its history. You can buy a New York Yankees cap in a market in rural Thailand. You can get a New York-style pizza, an approximation of one, at least, in cities on 6 continents. The bagel, which is itself a New York food in the sense that it was developed by the Ashkenazi Jewish community of the Lower East Side into its specific New York form, is now global. Though anyone from New York will tell you, with a conviction that borders on the religious, that a bagel made outside of New York is not a bagel in any meaningful sense. This is a hill that New Yorkers will die on. And honestly, they are not entirely wrong, because the specific mineral content of New York City water does affect the texture of boiled dough. And this is not mythology, it is chemistry. New York water is genuinely distinctive. The bagel thing is real. The internet does not always convey this nuance. The September 11 attacks of 2001 added a layer to New York's cultural mythology that is both recent enough to feel immediate and already subject to the kind of narrative shaping that historical events undergo. The attacks killed nearly 3,000 people. They destroyed the Twin Towers, which had themselves been controversial when they were built. Many New Yorkers and architectural critics in the 1970s found them cold, inhuman, too large, aesthetically unfortunate, and then they were gone, and everyone remembered loving them. Which is not entirely honest, but which is entirely human. The attacks produced an outpouring of genuine solidarity, both within New York and globally, that was, in the first days and weeks, one of the more remarkable communal responses to catastrophe in modern urban history. The missing persons posters, the makeshift memorials, the specific quality of grief in a city that normally does not slow down for anything, that was real. And then, over the years that followed, the event was folded into narrative and mythology and political use and commercial commemoration in ways that gradually separated the clean story from the complicated reality. The first responders, the firefighters and police officers and EMTs who ran toward the buildings, were celebrated rightly as heroes. And then, for years, those same first responders who developed cancers and respiratory diseases from the toxins in the wreckage were denied health benefits by the government that had called them heroes. The heroism was real. The celebration of it was real. The failure that followed was also real. New York's story, like New York itself, contains all of these things at once. The monument and the argument about who gets to build it. The tribute and the legal battle about who pays for the consequences. The symbol and the complicated human reality underneath the symbol. Always. Let us ask the question that is actually underneath every chapter we have covered tonight. Why did New York survive? Not just physically. Cities burn and flood and get invaded and occasionally go bankrupt. And New York has done most of those things, and it is still here. But why did it survive as a living thing? As a community, a culture, an identity so strong that people who have never visited it feel they know it, and people who left it decades ago still call themselves New Yorkers? Why did this particular city, on this particular island, with this particular history of inequality and disaster and political corruption and demographic upheaval and near financial collapse, why did this city not just persist but become by almost any measure one of the most consequential urban entities in human history? The answer is not simple, but it is, when you look at it carefully, deeply human. The first reason is geography, which we have mentioned several times, but which deserves one final direct acknowledgement. The harbor. The harbor made New York the natural gateway between the Atlantic Ocean and the interior of the North American continent. This geographic advantage did not guarantee New York's dominance. As we established, the Erie Canal was necessary to fully exploit it. But it meant that the city had an underlying structural advantage that competitors could not replicate without geography they did not have. Philadelphia could not move its river. Boston could not deepen its harbor. Baltimore could not carve a water route to the Great Lakes. New York had the starting position. And starting position, while not everything, is not nothing. The second reason is density. New York became dense faster than almost any other American city, and density, for all its costs, the tenements, the disease, the noise, the competition for space, produces something that lower density places struggle to replicate. Density produces collision, the collision of ideas, the collision of cultures, the collision of people who would never have encountered each other in the villages and towns and cities they came from. A Jewish immigrant from Odessa working a garment factory in 1905 might have her workspace 30 feet from an Italian immigrant from Palermo, and a Puerto Rican woman from San Juan and a black woman from Georgia. They might not all get along. They might compete for the same jobs, and the same apartments, and the same piece of the city's opportunity. But they were also in each other's presence, and presence, over time, produces things. It produces new foods and new music and new languages, the specific New York slang that crosses community boundaries, the food combinations that nobody planned, the cultural forms that could only have emerged from this specific density of human contact. Jazz was not invented in New York, but New York is where jazz became the language of the 20th century, because New York was where it collided with every other musical tradition on Earth, in the same clubs, and the same radio stations, and the same streets. The hip-hop that emerged from the South Bronx in the 1970s, from a community that was simultaneously being destroyed by urban policy and refusing to be destroyed, is another product of that density. art made from almost nothing, culture built in the ruins of what power had abandoned. That is New York surviving. That is the density doing what density does. The third reason is economic flexibility. New York has never been a one-industry city, despite the prominence of finance in its modern image. It has been, across its history, a trading city, a manufacturing city, a publishing city, a fashion city, a media city, a technology city, a service economy city. When one industry declined, another was already developing. When the garment industry moved out in the mid-20th century, the financial sector was expanding. When manufacturing left, the creative industries arrived. When print media contracted, digital media found its home in the same neighborhoods. The city's economy is diverse enough that no single shock can kill it. This is not an accident. It is a product of the same density and diversity that drives cultural production. Many different people from many different backgrounds with many different skills create many different economic activities. The monoculture economy is fragile. The diverse economy is resilient. New York is diverse in ways that go all the way down to the economic root. The fourth reason is memory. New York is a city that remembers itself, not always accurately, as we have spent much of tonight establishing, but persistently. The stories are told. The neighborhoods maintain their identities even as their populations change. The cultural institutions, the museums, the libraries, the concert halls, the universities, accumulate and preserve and transmit. The New York Public Library, which opened its main branch on Fifth Avenue in 1911, holds one of the great research collections in the world. It is free to use. Anyone can walk in. Anyone can sit at a table and read. A city that builds a free library of that scale is a city that has made a specific decision about what kind of place it wants to be. A place where knowledge is held in common, where the intellectual inheritance of civilization is not locked behind a private door. That decision was made in a specific moment in time by specific people with specific values, and it has survived because enough subsequent generations agreed that it was the right decision to keep making. That is how traditions survive, not through inertia, but through continuous recommitment. The fifth reason, and perhaps the most important, is that New York has always attracted people who needed it to work. Not people who chose it because it was comfortable. Not people who arrived with guarantees. People who came because the alternative was worse. People who came because they were fleeing poverty or persecution, or simply the limitation of a place that could not hold the size of what they wanted to do with their lives. These people needed the city to work in a way that people who have safety nets do not. They worked harder because they had less margin for failure. They built communities because they had no one else to rely on. They created cultural forms because creativity was available, even when material resources were not. The desperation that drove people to New York, and let us not romanticize it. Let us acknowledge that it was often real and painful desperation. That desperation became, paradoxically, the fuel of the city's extraordinary productivity. The city survived because it kept receiving people who needed it to survive. And those people, generation after generation, made sure that it did. Let us zoom out now, not to the satellite view, not to the map on the wall of the geography classroom. Something wider than that. Something that has less to do with borders and dates and the names of governors, and more to do with what it means that any of this happened at all. Because we have traveled a long way tonight. We started with ice. A mile of ice sitting on top of what would become the most famous urban landscape on Earth. We moved through the people who came after the ice, the ones who named the hills and ate the oysters, and understood the seasons in a way that took 10,000 years of careful attention to develop. We moved through the ships and the flags and the corporations and the empires, through the fires and the epidemics and the elections and the bankruptcies and the resurrections, through the labor and the suffering and the music and the art and the food. And now here, in the quietest part of the night, I want to ask the question that all of that history has been building toward. What does New York tell us about human beings? Not about Americans. Not about capitalism or democracy or immigration policy or urban planning. About human beings. About what we are, fundamentally, when you strip away the particular century and the particular flag and the particular economic system and look at what is underneath. The first thing New York tells us is that human beings are irreducibly drawn toward each other. This seems obvious, but it is actually remarkable. The density of New York. The sheer physical proximity of millions of people choosing to live in a space so compressed that their neighbors are sometimes inches away on the other side of a shared wall. This density is not something that was imposed on people from outside. People chose it. They chose it in enormous numbers, across centuries, from every corner of the world. They left places where they had more space, more quiet, more privacy, more fresh air, and they came to a crowded island and paid to be here. Why? Because the other people were here. Because where the people are is where the things happen. Because the human need for contact and stimulation, and the possibility of encounter, the possibility that tomorrow you might meet the person, or the idea, or the opportunity that changes everything, is stronger, in most people, than the need for space and quiet. New York is a 14,000-year argument in favor of human sociability. We are not, fundamentally, creatures who want to be alone. We say we do. We fantasize about the cabin in the woods and the quiet life and the slower pace. But we build New York over and over again, in every century, with every new group of arrivals. We build the density because something in us needs it. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The second thing New York tells us is that belonging is one of the most powerful forces in human life, and that the desire to belong can be both the most creative and the most destructive impulse a community contains. Creative because the communities that immigrants built in New York, the neighborhoods, the institutions, the cultural forms, the mutual aid societies, the religious congregations, the newspapers in a dozen languages, these were products of the need to belong in a place that did not yet feel like home. You build a community because you need one. You create a culture because you need to recognize yourself in your surroundings. You cook the food from home because the smell of it is the smell of being somewhere you are known. That creative impulse produced jazz and hip-hop and the New York School of Painting and the Yiddish theater and the salsa music of the Bronx and a thousand other things that the world did not have before a specific group of people arrived in a specific place and needed to feel at home. And destructive because the same need to belong, the same need to have a group that is yours, a community that recognizes you, produces the exclusion of others. The Irish who were excluded eventually participated in the exclusion of Black New Yorkers. The Jewish community that faced discrimination produced internal hierarchies between German Jews and Eastern European Jews. The groups that achieved some measure of belonging guarded it. Because belonging that is scarce feels like something that can be taken away, and the fear of losing it makes people hold it tightly, sometimes too tightly, sometimes in ways that contradict everything they said they believed about welcome and openness and the open door. New York is a city built by people who needed welcome and who did not always provide it. That contradiction is not a New York contradiction. It is a human one. The third thing New York tells us is that survival and beauty are not opposites. They are, in fact, deeply related. The moments of greatest cultural creativity in New York's history have not generally been the moments of greatest comfort and security. The Harlem Renaissance happened during the same decade as the Great Depression. Hip-hop emerged from the ruins of the South Bronx. The downtown art scene of the 1970s and 1980s, the painting and music and performance art that came out of neighborhoods like the East Village and Soho emerged in a city that was broke and dangerous and in some physical areas genuinely falling apart. When people have nothing, they make things. When the material world offers very little, the interior world expands. This is not a reason to want people to have nothing. It is not a romantic argument for poverty as a creative condition. It is an observation about what human beings do when they are pushed to the edge of what is survivable. They make art, they make music, they make something that says, I was here and I was alive, and the fact that things were hard does not mean that I did not also feel joy. New York has been making that statement in every possible medium for 400 years. The statement continues, the fourth human truth that New York offers us is about memory and forgetting. Cities forget. They forget the people who built them when those people are no longer useful to the story the city wants to tell about itself. The Lenape who named Manhattan The enslaved people who built its earliest walls and loaded its earliest ships. The Irish workers who died in the canal mud. The garment workers who jumped from burning windows. The prison ship dead, rotting in Wallabout Bay. These people are in the history. But they are not in the postcard. They are not in the skyline photograph. They are not in the Broadway musical about New York as a place of dreams and possibility and the magic of the city at night. And yet the city literally could not exist without them. The bedrock of New York is not just geological. It is human. It is made of the labor and the suffering and the endurance of people whose names were not recorded and whose stories were not preserved and who, nevertheless, did the work that made everything else possible. Remembering them is not an act of guilt. It is an act of accuracy. It is the difference between understanding where you actually are and believing the postcard. And understanding where you actually are is, in the end, the only way to understand where you might actually go. The fifth and final human truth. The one that this whole history, from the glaciers to the bankruptcy, to the billion oysters being returned to the harbor, keeps circling back to. New York tells us that places are not fixed, that the thing a place is today is not the thing it will always be. The harbor that was full of oysters was emptied and is being refilled. The neighborhood that was a Lenape seasonal ground became a Dutch trading post, became a British colonial city, became an American capital, became an immigrant destination, became a symbol, became a postcard, became something that 8 million people call home in the specific, daily, unremarkable, extraordinary way that people call places home. None of that was inevitable. All of it was chosen. By people making decisions under pressure with imperfect information about what the consequences would be. By people trying to survive and occasionally managing to build something beautiful in the process. By people who arrived with nothing and made something. By people who had everything and lost it and started again. By people who were brought here against their will and built a life anyway. By people who named the hills and ate the oysters and understood the seasons. The place keeps changing, the people keep coming, and somehow, in the middle of all of that change, in the middle of all of that arrival and departure and loss and building and burning and rebuilding, something persists. Something that is not quite a place and not quite a community and not quite an idea. Something that is all three of those things at once. Something that people all over the world recognize when they see the skyline, even if they have never stood beneath it. Something that the Lenape were building in their own way for 10,000 years before anyone put a name to the island. The human project. The ongoing, imperfect, stubborn, creative, cruel, generous, loud, exhausting, irreplaceable human project of making a place together, of deciding every day to stay. It is late now, not just the hour. Something in the quality of this moment wherever you are has shifted. The thinking part of tonight is mostly done. What is left is softer than thinking. More like the feeling you get when you have been somewhere interesting and are now on the way home. The details start to blur a little. The specific facts soften into impressions. The impressions soften into something that does not need a name. Let us stay in that softness for a while. New York at night is different from New York in the day. You probably know this already, even if you have never been there. There is a New York that belongs to the day. The quick movement and the noise and the density and the purposeful energy of millions of people going somewhere they need to be. And then there is the other New York, the one that appears after midnight, when the crowds thin, when the subway cars, which during the day are packed so tightly that strangers share the warmth of each other without meaning to, become quiet enough that you can see from one end of the car to the other. When the streets of Midtown, which during the afternoon are almost impassable, become open and quiet enough that you can hear your own footsteps. When the light changes, the specific amber of the streetlights on empty pavement, the glow of a diner through a window, warm and yellow, the kind of light that looks like something good is happening inside, even if what is actually happening is just a cook eating a sandwich between shifts. That light. New York after midnight is a different city from New York at noon, and it has always been that way. The night watchmen of Colonial New Amsterdam walked the streets after dark. They called out the hours, the time and the weather, announced into the quiet of a settlement that went to bed early, because candles cost money, and the dark was genuinely dark in the way we have forgotten dark can be. Rattle watch, they were called sometimes, because they carried rattles to raise an alarm. The sound of a rattle in the night meant something was wrong. Everything else was just the sound of a city sleeping, the creak of the wooden buildings contracting in the cold, the water moving against the pilings of the docks, the wind finding its way through the gaps that every building in every century has, no matter how carefully it was built. A city breathing, in the way that cities breathe, slowly, continuously, without thinking about it. The immigrants who came through Ellis Island, in the first hours after arrival, were sometimes taken to a ferry that brought them to the Manhattan shore in the early morning, before the city was fully awake. And they saw it for the first time in that specific early morning light. The buildings rising, the water around them, the sound of the city beginning its day. What they felt in that moment, each of them, was their own. Some of them were terrified. Some of them were elated. Some of them were so exhausted from the journey that they could not feel much of anything except the relief of having arrived somewhere solid. Some of them wept. Some of them held their children more tightly. Some of them looked at the skyline and made a private promise to themselves that we will never know the words of. All of them arrived. All of them began, and the city received them in the way the city receives everyone, without ceremony, without explanation. Just, here it is. This is the place. What you make of it is yours to figure out. There is something about islands that does something to the human mind. The water on all sides, the sense of being contained and also elevated, separate from the mainland in a way that is physical and psychological at once. Manhattan is an island. It is easy to forget this in the daily life of the city, where the bridges and tunnels connect it so seamlessly to everything around it that the water seems more like decoration than reality. But at night, from the right angle, you can feel the islandness of it, the water that surrounds it, the way the lights of the city reflect off the surface of the rivers on either side, the way the island seems, in the dark, to float, to be separate from the rest of the world in a way it is not quite separate from during the day. This is the feeling that writers and painters and photographers have been trying to capture for centuries, the specific luminosity of Manhattan at night. The way it looks like something that should not be possible. A human thing, risen from an ancient harbor, lit from within. Somewhere in the city tonight, as you listen to this, someone is beginning a shift. A nurse in a hospital in Queens is checking on her patients in the quiet of the ward. A baker in Brooklyn is beginning the first batch of bread that will be ready before the morning customers arrive. A subway train driver is making his 10th run of the night through tunnels that most of the city has forgotten exist. A security guard in a midtown office tower is walking the empty floors, the sound of his footsteps the only sound in rooms that during the day hold hundreds of people. A cook in a diner in the Bronx is getting ready for the people who will come in at 3 in the morning because they have finished their shift somewhere else and need eggs and coffee and a warm place to sit for 20 minutes before they go home. The city does not sleep, but the city also rests. It holds its sleeping people and its working people together in the same dark, the same bridges, the same rivers, the same bedrock that the glaciers shaped and the Lenape walked, and the Dutch built on, and the British renamed, and the Americans claimed, and the immigrants filled, and the artists transformed, and the financiers leveraged, and the ordinary people, the ones who just needed somewhere to live and work and raise their children, the ordinary people who made it all actually function. That bedrock is still there, under all of it, unchanged by any of it, patient in the way that only geology is patient, waiting for whatever comes next. The oyster beds are growing back, slowly, in the harbor that was emptied and is being refilled. The oysters do not know what the harbor looked like before. They do not know what it will look like in another 100 years. They filter the water. They build their shells. They attach themselves to the reef structures that human hands put there for them. They do the work that oysters do, which is, in its patient, continuous, quietly extraordinary way, the work of making the water cleaner than it was, making the harbor more alive than it was, undoing, one filtered gallon at a time, some small portion of the damage that was done. There is something in that, something that does not need to be stated directly to be felt, something about patience, about the long view, about the possibility that what was lost is not always lost forever, that the harbor can come back, that the water can clear, that the thing that was there before the city was also built from something ancient and resilient and quietly, persistently alive. Let your thoughts go soft now. You have held a lot of history tonight. You have held 10,000 years of a place. The ice and the people and the ships, and the flags and the fires, and the music and the labor, and the beauty and the loss and the rebuilding. You can set it down. It will be there in the morning. The history does not go anywhere. It is in the bedrock. It is in the harbor. It is in the name of the island, which still carries, in its syllables, a description of what the land looked like to the people who first named it. An island of hills, or an island of certain trees, or an island with a particular quality of water that the people who lived there understood in their bodies, the way you understand a place you have known your whole life. That name is still there, under everything. We began tonight with a contradiction, do you remember? We began with the idea that New York was always there, always waiting to be what it became, always destined for greatness as the story goes. And then we spent the better part of an evening pulling that idea apart, gently, carefully, with respect for the actual truth, which is messier and more interesting and more human than the destiny story allows. We found that the harbor was shaped by a mile of ice that did not care about destiny. We found that the people who named the island were here for 10,000 years before anyone thought to claim it. We found that the transaction that supposedly purchased Manhattan was a collision of two completely different understandings of what a transaction even means. We found that the city that was supposedly inevitable almost burned to the ground, almost went bankrupt, almost lost the commercial competition to Philadelphia, or Baltimore, or Boston. We found that every flag that flew over this island eventually came down, and the island remained. There is something I want to return to here at the end of the night. The oyster shell. We talked about it in the early chapters. The ancient oyster shell from a Lenape midden. The object that connects a person eating dinner on a summer afternoon thousands of years ago to everything that came after. Imagine holding it. It is light. It has the slight roughness on the outside that oyster shells have, and the smooth, curved interior where the animal lived before it became a meal. It is small enough to fit in your palm, and it is, in its quiet way, the whole history, the relationship between a people and a harbor, the abundance that was here before we arrived, and the damage we did to it, and the slow, patient work of restoration. The meal that was eaten on a summer afternoon by someone who did not know what was coming, who could not have known, who was simply hungry, and it was summer, and the harbor was full. The city that grew up over those shell middens is one of the most complex human constructions in history. Not the tallest buildings, not the most ancient history, not the most beautiful streets, but perhaps the most concentrated expression of what human beings are capable of when you take an extraordinary natural setting and fill it with an extraordinary density of human need and ambition and fear and creativity and desperation and hope, all at once, all in the same place, all pressing against each other in the productive, painful, generative way that things press against each other when there is not quite enough room. New York happened because the harbor was there, and because the beavers were there, and because the Dutch West India Company needed to make money, and because Peter Stuyvesant was stubborn enough to build a wall in the wrong direction, and because the English fleet came from the sea anyway, and because DeWitt Clinton would not accept that the canal was a foolish idea, and because the Erie Canal worked better than anyone expected, and because desperate people keep arriving and keep building, and because the bedrock is strong enough to hold whatever we put on top of it, and because the harbor, even damaged, even emptied, even polluted beyond what seemed recoverable, kept existing, kept being there, waiting. What you carry out of tonight, if you carry anything, is not a list of dates. It is not a corrected set of facts to deploy at a dinner party, though you are welcome to deploy them. The $24 Manhattan Purchase, the Ellis Island name change myth, the Statue of Liberty and its retrofitted meaning. You are welcome to all of those. But what I hope sits with you more quietly, more persistently, is the feeling of the depth. The feeling that underneath the skyline photograph and the tourism poster and the film set and the brand and the symbol. There is an island, an actual island, made of actual rock, surrounded by actual water, on which actual human beings have been living and working and arguing and eating and sleeping and loving and dying and making things and losing things and starting over for an unimaginably long time. And that those human beings, across all of those centuries and all of those different flags and languages and economic systems and ways of understanding the world, were doing what you are doing right now, trying to be alive in a place, trying to make something of where they found themselves, trying to feel, in however small a way, at home. The city is quieter now than it was 12 hours ago. Not silent, never silent, but quieter. The subway trains are running their overnight routes through tunnels that go deeper than the foundations of the oldest buildings. The rivers are moving around the island the way they have always moved. The harbor water is dark and cold and full, somewhere in its depths, of the growing reef structures where the oysters are doing their slow, patient filtering work. The bridges are lit. The sky above Manhattan, orange with light pollution, holds somewhere behind it the same stars that the Lenape navigated by. They are still there. You just cannot see them from here. And somewhere in the city right now, someone is arriving for the first time. Maybe at the airport. Maybe at a bus station. Maybe they came over a bridge in a car packed with everything they own, watching the skyline appear as they crossed from New Jersey into the tunnel. Maybe they stepped off a subway train in a neighborhood they have never seen before and stood on the platform for a moment before the doors closed. Behind them, they are in the city now, the same city that received the Lenape before there was a city, the same city that received the Dutch and the British and the Sephardic Jews fleeing Brazil and the Irish fleeing the famine and the Italians and the Eastern European Jews and the Black Americans from the South and the Puerto Ricans and the Chinese and the Dominicans and the Mexicans in the West, Africans and the South Asians, and every other wave of human need that has washed up on this island and stayed. The city does not greet them with ceremony. It does not explain itself. It simply continues to be what it is: dense, loud, improbable, alive. And the person who just arrived begins the process of figuring out what that means for them. The same process that has been running continuously on this island for 10,000 years. The process of arriving somewhere and deciding to stay, of finding a way to make the place yours, of adding your layer to the layers, your shell to the midden, your voice to the noise. Let the city be there tonight without you in it. Let the harbor be dark and moving. Let the oysters do their work. Let the subway run through its tunnels. Let the bridges hold. Let the bedrock hold everything above it the way it has always held everything above it, with the patience of something that was shaped by a mile of ice, with the indifference of geology, with the quiet permanence of a place that was here before any of this and will be here in some form long after. You have been to New York tonight, not the postcard version, the real one, the muddy, multilingual, fire-prone, bankruptcy-adjacent, oyster-eating, wall-building, canal-digging, jazz-making, immigrant-receiving, argument-having, stubbornly, improbably surviving real one. And now you can rest. The island will be there in the morning. It always is, it always has been. An island of many hills, surrounded by moving water, full of people trying to figure out how to live together in a place that was not built for any of them, but somehow became home to all of them. That island is still there. That project is still running, and you, wherever you are tonight, you are part of the same project. On whatever island, whatever hill, whatever patch of bedrock you happen to be resting on right now, the same ice shaped it, the same water moves around it, the same stars are above it, behind whatever light is in your sky. The same old human work is yours to continue in the morning. But not tonight. Tonight you rest.